This is the PowerPoint over evolution. When we talk about evolution, we're talking about change over time. And when we're talking about change over time, we're talking about long periods of time, hundreds to thousands of years. When you're talking about that, we're talking about an entire population changing, not just a single organism or a couple of organisms. But in order for things to change, they have to have the genetic information for such changes. So you have organisms reproducing by sexual reproduction. When animals sexually reproduce, they pass on their genes to the next generation. And what we have is that the genes for the best survival in the future, because of evolution, are passed on. So that's what we see, this increased frequency of the alleles that are most popular and allow us to populate our planet with the most successful organisms, which allows us to have variation in our gene pool. If we all self-pollinated or self-reproduced, asexual reproduction, we wouldn't have this variation, and so our species wouldn't survive very long. In order to have evolution, we have 4 requirements. We have variation, inheritance, selection, and time. So when we have variation, that's taking the genetic pool and making variations in genetic information. So we have that by having cross-pollination or sexual reproduction. In inheritance, that's what we're passing on to our offspring, that genetic variability that allows us to pass on our best traits to the next generation. The selection is picking the most successful traits to pass on. This is going to be the organisms that survive under more difficult conditions, whereas the weak will die, the strong will survive. It's called survival of the fittest. Time, it takes time to evolve. Evolution doesn't occur over days, weeks, months. It occurs over long periods of times for full communities to evolve with the best traits. And that's talking about hundreds to thousands of years. Charles Darwin is the man behind the mask, and he is the gentleman responsible for the discovery of evolution. And evolution is a theory. It's what we believe to be true, and so far his evidence proves to be the same as it was when he was here in 1809 to 1882. What he did was, when he was 21, he embarked on a journey around the world. He took a 5-year tour of the world, jumping on the boat called the Beagle, and looking at all the species and organisms that were all over the world in different places and their habitats. And what he realized was that organisms are descendants from previous organisms. So we're evolving over time. If we didn't have evolution, we wouldn't have variability in our genes. We'd all be identical to our past history families. So genetic variability allows us to have evolution. We look at the whole population evolving, not just one individual. Evolution is not one individual changing, it's a whole population changing. And we talked about a theory already, being the idea of what he came up with. You can try it out and look at the evidence that supports it, but it is not an absolute. It can be changed. But so far, so good. Darwin seemed to know what he was talking about. So anyway, he didn't do that alone. We'll talk about the people that helped him find his way in his belief in evolution. He went on the Beagle for 5 years. He was there to collect and observe, collect evidence like fossils and different things from around the world. He took the trips that you see here in these lines that travel around the map. And then we're going to look at here that says, back again to saying a theory is just a statement, a model showing how he thinks it occurs. It's a prediction, but it's not an absolute. That means it can change. It's just how we view the world at the moment. When you see patterns like diversity, for example, when he visited Argentina and Australia, he noticed similarities. What he also noticed was differences, that he said that neither Australia or Argentina had the kinds of grasslands that they had in Europe. So he posed some questions, and as he went around the world, he did exactly that. He'd collect evidence like fossils, and then he'd ask some more questions, and then he'd realize, these are ancient organisms from our past, and these have evolved into something different today. So then he kept asking himself questions. When he went to the Galapagos Islands, he saw the turtles, the large tortoises. And what he noticed was the shapes of their shells were different in different areas. And what he noticed were the ones that had the curved back shell, and the long necks were where the land was dry, hot and dry, and that it didn't have a lot of vegetation. So the animals had to have long necks to reach the sparse vegetation. And then when he realized on Isabella Island that the tortoises had these different types of shells. They also had shorter necks. And what he realized was they had those shorter necks because it had rich vegetation. They didn't have to reach the barren areas in the Hood Island, like the ones that had the longer necks. They could have those short necks because it was everywhere. Here are some other things that he checked out. One of the most significant of these are his birds. They're called Darwin's finches. And what he did was he was able to look at these finches and observe they were different. And what he found out was they were the same bird, but they were different because they had different beaks. If you go back here and you look at the different beaks here in these pictures, you're going to see they're changed from being long and sharp to short and rounded on the edges, and you'll see different ways in which they're shaped. The idea was they lived in different areas that had different types of food sources. So for example, the ones that had the beaks that were a little stronger looking up here, they had larger seeds to crack, and here they probably had to reach for their seeds, and there were smaller seeds that they had to crack open. But each of these beaks were different because they had different sources of nutrients. And so what he found out that they lived in different areas. Based upon the shape of the beak, it told him where they came from. And it was because they were eating different foods. So, Darwin observed that characteristics in many plants and animals are greatly diverse among islands. And what he hypothesized was they may have an original ancestor. We all came from the same place. That's what he was saying. Here are some of the people that influenced his theories. Darwin believed that James Hutton was one of the people that helped him understand evolution. And what James was interested in was looking at the Earth's surface and how it changed. How we had Pangea and then we slowly moved away into thousands of years, changing the way that the Earth looks. So the change occurred slow over time, just as he believes that evolution does. So, Charles here was another person who influenced him. Again, geography. What he believed was that features can be built up or broke down. So, Darwin was like, well, if that can be true about the Earth, can it be true about animals? Plants and animals on the Earth. Now here, Lamarck's theory. What he believed was the tendency toward perfection. So in the case of the giraffe, the neck of the giraffe started to get longer and longer because it had to reach up to get more food. So that's what he believed was the case, that as we evolve, we progress to fit our environment. Here's another person. Thomas was an individual that he believed that populations had a limit, that he was an economist and he believed that you only have so many people that can live in the world before you start to run out of resources. Not just people, but animals and anything taking up space and using the resources available, that eventually will run out of those resources. And so this again went down to Darwin's theories of survival of the fittest. Those that are most fit will survive, those who are not won't. And so in the case of here, where you run out of supplies, you find a way to adapt or you die. But this again is talking about an economist, whereas Darwin was a scientist. Same kind of idea. Anyway, eventually Darwin decided to write his own book, and so he wrote The Origin of the Species. There are two different types of selection. You have natural selection and artificial selection. When you talk about natural selection, it happens over time. It's not something that has happened overnight or in a couple days. Natural selection occurs over time. So you'll see again where we had animals on the brink of extinction, and some of those are naturally occurring events. Global warming is one of those natural occurring events that yes, we have control to make it better or worse, but it is still nature that's changing. Artificial selection is talking about things that humans have done to change that organism. So, for example, selecting the perfect breed of dog. So if you're choosing artificial, it's because you're selecting it for a purpose as a human being, whereas natural selection is occurring because of nature, natural nature. So when we look at, again, the existence of species, that we struggle to compete for food, shelter, and life necessities. So in the case of the wild, you have animals that will pick their turf and stand up and fight for what they have. And what they do is survival of the fittest. So the best suited for the environment will be the ones who survive. If you've ever watched any of the stories about animals, you'll see that a lot of times they abandon the ones who are sick. And it's because they do not see the necessary need to use their resources on an organism that's not going to survive. As not very nice as that sounds, that is how evolution works, as well as survival of the fittest. Natural selection, this is occurring over time. Remember, it's not just a one-night thing or 2 days or one organism. It's an entire population. We're passing on our favorite traits, the things that make us the strongest, weeding out the weak characteristics and genes that don't help us survive in our current environment. Like I said, it's over thousands of years. Sexual selection, as you see this beautiful peacock. When we have sexual selection, you're trying to pick the mate that has the best qualities to help your genetic traits to move forward in the evolutionary tree. So it is important to pick an organism as your mate that's going to help survive and increase the chances of your lineage moving forward. Here we have descent. You're seeing Darwin called evolution. Here's his descent with modifications, and common descent. So common descent is the ancestor that we all have in common. He believes that we came from one ancestor and derived from there. So descent with modifications is that over time we're changing. And that would be his, conversation of evolution. If you look at the pictures on this page, you're going to see as time moves on, we're seeing that evolution of the skull changing into a more humanistic from the original skulls that were present. Here is another that shows evidence of evolution. If you look here, you're going to see the fossil records here up in the right of a horse. When we start out, we're looking at the different types of bones looking very similar to one another, and as we continue to move along, they evolve. You're seeing the evolution of the changing of the skull to the changing of the bones and the legs, and this is evidence of change. Here we also have geographic distribution of living things, and they're changing based upon their environment. Remember, all of them being different climates and different locations, some near the equator, some further from the equator, so they're evolving to suit their needs where they live, their habitat. A homologous structure, remember we said homo means same, so a homologous structure is talking about, I've lost my mouse, talking about the structures having the same form. So if you look up here at the top, you're going to see these pictures across the top that all look like arms. They all have, see how they're colored the same? That's showing you the bones they have in common. Then you're going to see the muscles they have in common, and that they have kind of like fingers or hands kind of shape idea. So it's showing that connection between all these looking very similar. Vestibular is talking about the fact that we have different organs in our body, such as the appendix, which is the tiny little, where the little star is there in that picture on the bottom, and then our third molars, which is the little 3 orange lines there that kind of show us where we have third molars, which are your wisdom teeth. You usually get those about 18, 19, and goosebumps. All those don't have any purpose anymore. We used to have a purpose for them, but there's no purpose any longer. So evolution hasn't made them go away, but evolution has made them be with no purpose. Evidence of evolution, similar in early development, you're going to see, if you look on the right, comparative embryology. Embryology is when embryos, new babies, start to form after you get some development from the sperm and egg coming together and creating life. You're going to see the fish, the reptile, the bird, and the human all looking very similar as they are embryology-wise. Again, going back to Darwin's idea that we all come from a similar ancestor. Here are his summaries. We're all unique. We survive by reproducing and providing diversity in our genetic makeup. The most successful of us will survive and pass on our lineage. We'll adapt or die. We're modified from our descendants to pass on those better traits. And we all come from a similar ancestor.